The question of who created God is complex and involves both philosophy and theology. In most monotheistic religious traditions, such as Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, God is described as an eternal and uncreated being, meaning that he was not created by anyone. He has always existed and has no beginning or end. The idea of God as a self-existent being is fundamental to many of these beliefs. Main details: God's eternity. In Christian theology, God is often described as eternal, without beginning or end. For example, in Psalm 92, the Bible says, "Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." This concept suggests that God transcends time and space. Self-existence. God is considered self-existent, which means that he exists by his own nature, without the need for a creator or anything external to sustain him. This idea is known as aseity, from the Latin asetus, which means existence from oneself. Necessary being. In many philosophical traditions, such as the work of Thomas Aquinas, God is considered a necessary being. This means that God's existence does not depend on anything else. He simply exists by logical necessity. All other beings are contingent, dependent on something else for their existence. But God, as a necessary being, does not depend on anything. Infinite and unchanging God is described as infinite, which means that he is not limited by time, space, or anything else. He is also immutable and changeable. Since being perfect, any change would imply imperfection. Philosophical cosmology. In philosophical debates about the origin of the universe, it is argued that if everything has a cause, then there must be a first cause or an uncaused cause. In this view, God would be that first cause, the source of all other causes, but he himself would not require a cause. This argument is known as the cosmological argument. According to most religious and philosophical traditions, God is a being who is not created. He is eternal, self-existent, and necessary, transcending time and space, and is the source of all that exists. The question who created God is considered invalid within this perspective, because God is not an entity within the universe that would need to be created, but rather the ultimate foundation of all existence. In philosophy, besides the cosmological argument mentioned earlier, there are other approaches that discuss the nature of God and his existence. One of the most famous arguments is the ontological argument, developed by Anselm of Canterbury. This argument asserts that the very idea of God implies his existence. God is defined as the most perfect being one can imagine, and existence would be one of the characteristics of a perfect being. Therefore, if we can conceive of the idea of a perfect God, he must exist. Another philosopher, René Descartes, contributed a similar argument. He argued that just as the idea of a triangle necessarily includes the property of having three sides, the idea of God includes the property of existence. Thus, for Descartes, thinking of God is, in some way, confirming his existence. Scientific perspective. Although the question of God's creation is predominantly theological and philosophical, some scientists have attempted to approach the question of God's existence from a cosmological perspective. One of the most discussed theories is the Big Bang theory, which suggests that the universe had a definite beginning. However, even with this theory, the question of what caused the Big Bang, or what existed before it, remains open and often leads to speculations about the existence of a first cause, which many theologians identify as God. Nonetheless, science generally does not address the question of who created God, as this is a question that transcends the domain of empirical science, being more of a metaphysical and theological matter. The divine mystery. Ultimately, the question of who created God can be seen as a reflection of human limitations in understanding the totality of the divine. For many religious traditions, God is a mystery that transcends human comprehension. He's beyond the categories we use to understand the world, such as time, space, and causality. For believers, God is the starting point of all reality, the unoriginated origin that gives meaning and cause to everything. Thus, the question about God's creation can be considered unsolvable within the limits of human logic and language. For believers, God simply is, without needing a creator or an origin. Faith, in this context, is the acceptance of the divine mystery and the inability to fully comprehend it. The question who created God is ultimately one that challenges both philosophy and theology. Religious traditions generally assert that God is an eternal and uncreated being, while philosophy offers different approaches that attempt to address the idea of a necessary being. Science, on the other hand, remains neutral on metaphysical questions like this. For believers, God is the source of all existence and the ultimate foundation of reality, existing without beginning or end, beyond human understanding.